Great. Well, welcome everybody and good morning to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We are picking up our work this morning on Wednesday, April 26th with H490, which is an act relating to approving the merger of the village of Lyndonville with the town of Linden. And we have former Representative Marty Feltus with us. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And you could introduce yourself and your capacity in this charter business, and then please tell us about, tee things up, I guess, for our work on the bill today.
Okay. All right. I'm Marty Feltus. I have lived in Lyndonville, both of them, for the past 40 years. And I was a village trustee for many years. I was on the planning commission for many years. I was a town selectman for 20 years. And I served the town as a representative of the state legislature for 10 years as well. We have a town of 36 square miles. Within that town, there is a village called Lyndonville. There used to be 3 villages: Linden Center, Linden Corner, and Lyndonville. Linden Center and Linden Corner were historic development patterns from the early 1800s. They incorporated themselves as villages within the town in the 1880s. Lyndonville was brand new. Lyndonville was created by the railroad. Their maintenance shops at the Connecticut and Pacific Railroad, it was called at the time, had a large maintenance facility in St. Johnsbury. It burned down in 1860, and the railroad decided to build a new maintenance area, and they moved upriver to the plains in the valley along the Passumpsic River. They bought 350 acres of 2 or 3 farms, and they set up this village of Linden. They built their maintenance sheds, a new depot. They laid out streets, they created parks, they built housing for their workers, they sold house lots for their executives to build houses along the parks. We had our first zoning. They said how tall buildings had to be and how far back from the street and all that sort of thing. So that's the origins of Lyndonville, and it didn't start until 1860. It was a brand new community. But all 3 then villages, Linden Center, Linden Corner, and Lyndonville, decided to incorporate themselves as separate villages within a town that was already there in about the 1880s. And the motive for all of them was in order to get enough, in order to be able to raise taxes, to provide a water system in each of them. And in Lyndonville's case, they also wanted to be able to create an electric department. So those 3 operated separately, but there was also the town government, the select board, that did the whole town. And then you had these 3 little villages inside. And there were fire districts and school districts and stuff like that went with them as well. But they've all since disappeared. And the village of Linden Center and the village of Linden Corner dissolved their charters back in the 1960s. Lyndonville is the only one that's still as a separate village. So that's the history. The town is 5,000 people. The people that live within the village limits, which is very, very small, is 1,500, I think. There's a fact sheet I had sent to you that should be on your webpage that gives some summary of what those general things are. So the town's 5,000. We have 1,500 in the village. The grand list of the whole town is 3.747. The village is only 694. It's only a tiny fraction, not a fraction, it's about a fifth of the whole town. But we have 2 separate governments. The town government covers all the standard things of the whole town, and the police department, the fire department, the library, the cemetery, the listers, all of that is a town function. But the village function covers the streets within the village, which of course get a lot more traffic than any place else, because it is literally geographically and commercially the center of the town. And the parks functions and some other things that happen only within the village. But their grand list is very, very small compared to the whole town. And yet their expenses are about half as much as the whole town. So the tax burden on the villages, on the residents and the businesses within the village is much greater than the tax burden on people who live outside. That's one of the reasons that we've talked in the last 40 years of trying to merge the two together and spread the expenses everywhere. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, a lot of the people who lived outside of the village said, no, we don't participate in what happens in the village. You know, I'm not obligated to help pay for those streets and those sidewalks and those kinds of things because I live out here on my farm and, you know, I'm not really involved in what's happening. That sentiment has changed over time. The last serious time we did this was in 2006. And we came up with this charter, and I know the charter you looked at, what we've presented to you is slightly modified from 2006. So some of the legal constructs are maybe a little outdated, but nevertheless, they are legal. But at that point, it passed, but then there was an upswelling of opposition and we had a revote and it failed the second time around. So now it's been 20 years later, but there have been a lot more things happening in terms of people who live outside the geographic limits of the village, who participate in what happens in the whole town and are very interested in making it all one community. There's a lot more community. From my point of view, of having viewed it, there's a lot more interest in really revitalizing what is the literal center of town with all the activities that the rest of the town does. And so this time around, there was a lot more support for making the merger. Over time, the village trustees and the town selectmen have had a history of being very cooperative. They try to don't step on each other's toes. They try to coordinate when they have activities. It's interesting because the village owns the water department, the town owns the sewer department, and so you've got, you know, the village folks trying to figure out what to do with the water department, which extends beyond the village, of course. And the town has the sewer department, which is the village and extends beyond. But the two go together, obviously. When you're digging up a street to fix the water line, you also need to be fixing the sewer line and that sort of thing. So they've tried to cooperate a lot, and they do. But nevertheless, you have the idea from a financial point of view, these expenses are here and these expenses are here. And it's this tax base that has to cover that and this tax base that has to cover that. And so it has become very complex. And, you know, they're always, you know, from a bookkeeping point of view, I see our town clerk is watching. From a bookkeeping point of view, the town's paying the village paying the town. You go back and forth. Every quarter, they have to reconcile the books because, you know, they're borrowing somebody from one department to do this and somebody from one department to do that, and you have to go back and forth. So there's a lot of quirky things like that that are not upsetting. They're just cumbersome for the people who are doing the day-to-day work in the town. It can be done, of course. It has been done all this time. But one of our motives for wanting to merge is to streamline all that, get rid of all of that cross back and forth between the town and the village. But really the bigger question, I think, that both the select board and the trustees came to the conclusion is that they would, together, they could do a better job for the whole community if there was only one board that looked at everything as opposed to two separate boards. Because by their very function, the village trustees look only at exactly what happens within the village. The town selectmen look at all the rest of the stuff. And if they could coordinate their things and look at long-term strategies, do long-term planning in terms of road construction, expansion of sewer, water lines, that sort of thing, that they could be more effective for the whole town. And by joining the two different, what we call highway departments, this village streets and the town highway, you know, obviously there's different kinds of equipment that's needed, and that would still be needed. We're not going to eliminate any of that, but they can transfer skills back and forth a lot better in terms of the personnel. And there are lots of examples of how they could provide services in a faster, more efficient way if it was one single department with one single chief instead of two different departments fighting back and forth about what's going on. So those are really the main reasons that the town has come together and the village and said, you know, we really think we need to merge and get rid of the two separate governments and have one single government. So that's the motive behind it all.
Well, thank you for telling us the story and some of the history. I think you're not alone from some of the other experience we've had of either, you know, towns and villages separating or them merging, and you know, each community has a different story. I think it's one of the fun things about being on GovOps is to delve a little bit into what some of our towns and villages are doing across the state. Do you folks have questions for former Representative Feltus about the kind of the history before we dig into some of the details and talk to the staff a little bit? Representative Morgan.
Just one question, Mario. I know because I've testified now on a couple of these with Senate GovOps, getting into the nitty gritty of votes and what was the voting turnout and the vote totals. Do you have that information in front
I
of you?
do, as a matter of fact.
Curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We did it in November, so we would have the general election to get as many possible votes as possible. We have 3,700 registered voters, and of those, half of them, 1,599 participated.
Okay.
And so the townwide vote was 948 to 651, 948 in favor. Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Because we have a village within a town, the village voted as well, because the village has to say, we want to dissolve and become part of the town. The town has to say, we want to have the village be incorporated as part of the town. So the village voted separately, just the separate village. And there are 785 voters there.
So that 3,700 did not include these 780?
No, it did include them.
Oh, it did include
See,
them. Okay, 785.
So the village votes, and then they are also members of the town, so they vote as town members as well. So as a separate village, half of them voted, and it was overwhelming, 235 yes to 45 no. But overall, the total participation was, the total participation overall was 42%. The total participation in only the village was 36%. The participation outside the village was 44%. But overall, the town vote was 59% in favor.
Right. Gotcha. So that means, I'll say it one more time, I'm sorry for being a bonehead. So
No.
in that 3,700 is the 785?
Yes.
Party?
Yes.
And then, so 1,599 total was village and town?
Yes, and
And
village.
that vote, 948, 651, has embedded in that,
Village
that
vote.
235, 45 from the village component?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Just want to make sure my brain had that right.
Yeah. It's always confusing that way.
So about almost, well, not 2 to 1, but 1.5.
Yeah, it was close to 45, 50%.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I first looked at your vote totals, I just saw the village vote. I said, wow, that's a pretty low turnout.
Oh.
Then I found out, yes, the village and the town, everybody who lives in the village also votes in the town, and that's a much bigger vote.
Right.
So thank you for making that very explicit for us, especially those of us who don't live in municipalities inside of municipalities.
A muni within a muni.
Not unique. We have a number of those in our state. Well, anything else you'd like to tell us before we move on to talking to some of your municipal staff?
I guess only the potential objections that people had. But number one was the tax issue, because if we put all of the expenses currently of the town and the village together and eliminate the duplicates of the payments that go back and forth to each other, we're still going to spend the same amount of money overall. And we're still going to need, but we use the tax base of the whole town as opposed to the two separate tax bases. Those that live within the village will see a dramatic decrease in their property taxes. Those that live outside the village will see an increase of almost 10 cents. So based on that, and it's $189 on a $200,000 property. If you lived outside the village. That would be the increase. We were sensitive to that. We know that's certainly critical to everybody. So we devised a system of doing it of implementing this change over 3 years in terms of the tax rate. So that for those that are outside the village, it would go up 2 cents and then 3 cents and then 2 cents, something along that line. And in the village, it would go down it goes down a total of 30 cents. So it went down 10 cents and then 12 cents and then 15 cents or something.
30
like that.
cents?
Yeah, right now there's a 41-cent difference. So, people living in the same $200,000 house are paying a much higher tax bill if you live in the village, and businesses as well. One of our concerns was that, the village is small geographic and it's all built up. There's really no place else to go. There's not much increase in the grand list that's going to happen unless you destroy some buildings and build new buildings. There isn't a way to increase that grand list. And many of our businesses are right there, and they're, of course, paying that higher rate. And new businesses, even though there may be a space to come in, would prefer to be outside the village because the tax rate is less. And yes, that's where the space is, but there still is space within the center village as well. And we would like to make sure that that still has some opportunity for economic development within the village, the former village space.
Representative Hooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Marty, I'm looking at the map, and I remember at the beginning you said there were 3. Is the village sports shop in the village
Yes,
and
just
McDonald's?
barely. No, McDonald's is out.
And the thing that they describe here as Linden Center?
It's across the river.
Yeah.
The river is the dividing line. So Linden Center, where Linden Institute and
Not part of this discussion then.
they are in the town,
Okay.
Not the village.
but not the village.
And the state's not in the village.
Linden State's not in the village. no.
Northern Vermont University.
Right.
My kids went through, they still call it.
Oh, right. Sure.
Well, I think you've done a great job telling a story and teeing things up for us. And I assume you'll want to stick around and hear the rest of the testimony.
Definitely, yeah.
Next on our list, we have Justin Smith, the administrator for the town, I believe, who's on Zoom. If I understand the note right, you're wanted to zoom into our colleagues over in Senate Transportation in a little while. So I wanted to make sure we got your testimony in before we lose you to them.
I appreciate that. Thank you for allowing me to speak to the committee today. I am a town employee. I am the municipal administrator for the town and also the municipal administrator for the village. So I serve a dual role of both municipalities. Most of my testimony today is just going to be about efficiencies. We have a number of things that go on in the town and village that we attempt to do together. We do work very well side by side, as Marty mentioned, but from a term of finances and making sure that each tax base is paying the appropriate amount, there are a lot of things that both Dawn, who's with me here, and I have to separate and divide and keep appropriate tabs on. Some of those things that I want to talk about are one of the efficiencies we made is we put the public works building, or both highway and public works for the town and village in one building. So we are already making some changes to how we've operated in the past. We had separate buildings for both. We put them both under one roof now. With that being said, we're right on the town village line on Hill Street. And when we have any kind of a storm event, we have both crews going out. And for a lot of the town crew, they're going through the village streets with their plows up until they get to the town border, and then they drop plows, start spreading salt, sand, whatever it is. And we believe that there are some efficiencies there that could be created through a merged community. We could take all 9 of our crew members and devise better strategies for plowing our streets and maintaining our roads that currently we can't. Because we have to keep track of who's paying for that. Additionally, we have a police department. It is a town-run department, but there's a intermunicipal agreement where the police serves the village. And we basically have a call volume, and we divide the budget by the call volume and where we're spending our time. But when we go to figure out how much of the cost is getting paid by which municipality, it's not that simple split of 60-40. Because the village residents live in the town, they're already paying the general fund grand list figure. So we have to first decide how much of the village's grand list is in relation to the towns. Take that amount of money out of what the village is gonna owe, because the village residents are already paying for a portion of it in the town. And then send the village taxpayer the remaining percentage after we figure that out. It's very confusing. We do have a formula for it, but when you're talking to a taxpayer about why the police department costs so much, or how come they're only paying this percentage, you have to explain to a town resident, well, the village resident lives in your town, they're paying the town general fund rate. So we have to take that out before we figure out what the village general fund portion is gonna be. Other things that we have to do, obviously there's revenues and expenses that go back and forth. At budget time, town budget is determined and voted on at town meeting, so we start working on those budgets in the fall. And then the trustees or the village meeting is 2 weeks later. So we begin devising budgets for the village after we complete the town's budgets. And because there are a number of things that go back and forth, we have to pay, we have to devise a cost for our village crew, who is the public works department, that does all the maintenance on the town's sewer lines and the village's water lines. We have to determine how much time we're gonna spend on sewer, make a budget for that expense line for labor. And then we have to turn around on the town side, put an expense in, and on the village's side, make a revenue line for what we're gonna be reimbursed for the village employees' time spent on town projects. I hope I'm not confusing you too much, but I think you're getting a good view of why we would like to merge. Additionally, we have obviously village employees that are overseen by me, but also the village trustees. They have projects the village is expecting to get done, but at the same time, they have sewer projects for the town that need to get done. And when those two things conflict with one another, our employees are left with that wondering, so do I serve the town or do I serve the village? Because I'm a village employee, does everything in the village project-wise come first? I can certainly understand that that's our management issue to deal with, but it is confusing for an employee when they're trying to determine which is their job first. Other examples on projects, I'll give you the example of College Road. We just recently paved the roadway up to Northern Vermont University. The town has wanted to take on that project for, I'm gonna say, 5 years now. We finally did it last year. And the holdup was the fact that the village also has a planning function, and part of their plan was to do a water line project. Sitting in the position I do, I serve both town and village. I knew that that project, water line wise, was a few years away. And we had a road that was definitely deteriorating and in need of repair. But with two different entities, with two different project timelines, it's difficult to plan for those things. So they ended up waiting for the water line to go through because the road was going to get torn up for that reason. And then finally, we did the paving project this last year. So having one board serving this community will allow us to do some planning functions that currently, despite how well we do try to work together, are difficult as far as financial planning goes. The clerk also had a list of things that she would like you folks to know, which is currently we have 7 different funds between the town and village. We have a general town highway fund, a general fund, a highway fund, a sewer fund, and currently an ARPA fund. And then on the village side, we have a general/highway fund, a water fund, and an ARPA fund. So we have 7. We would eliminate 2 if we merged. And it just makes the functioning of finances a lot easier if we're not keeping track of so many funds. Each municipality has their own separate bank accounts and restricted funds. We would be able to combine some of those. We didn't have an exact number at this point of how many we would be able to consolidate that to, but certainly there would be a number of them that we would be able to get rid of. Each highway department does work for the other, as I mentioned, and she's required to do weekly intermunicipal billing back and forth for those hours. And then there's also quarterly intermunicipal billing, and that would be for things like we have a VACON truck, which is owned by the town of Linden. But the Public Works Department, which is the village employees, actually operate the piece of equipment. So we have billing issues, I will say, as far as if that truck is used or that piece of equipment is used by the village employees for a village project, she has to bill the village for the use of that equipment, which is town owned. Opposite, if we're doing a sewer line project and we're using that same piece of town equipment, there's no bill for the equipment, but we have to bill back for the village employee hours that are worked. So at the end of each quarter, we add those up and make the appropriate adjustment to each budget. Additionally, we have the opportunity to go to one audit, one town report, one annual meeting, as opposed to 2 of all of those things. All shared materials would be accounted for. I mean, we have a salt pile, we have sand piles, and we basically keep charts on that to show what each entity is using. And it would be nice to have one budget for those materials, and then wherever they're used. But we have employees that have to keep track every time they add a bucket load of salt to a truck to salt, because we only have one place to store it.
So, Mr. Smith, I think that the committee is thoroughly convinced that there are efficiencies that we can achieve throughout your town government. And I hate to shorten up your testimony, but
You had reached the end of my list, so I was done anyway.
if we're gonna try to move this, we need to start moving through the bill with legislative council very soon. So don't want to cut anybody off, but it sounds like there's a very good case. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It sounds like Mr. Daly was a member of the committee. I also have you here to weigh in. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you very much. And thank you for your due diligence on this process on your end. I really, honestly, I can't really add anything more than what Marty and Justin have added. In my time on the select board, I will say that, we saw time and time again the inefficiencies of having these two entities, that were working together but separately. As Marty mentioned, I will say that over the last few years, we worked very hard on the planning end. We've hired a separate planning administrator who has worked very diligently to kind of bring the community together, to bring certain grants and other activities to the town to try to unify us. But again, I'm not going to repeat what they said, but the time is now for us to become one entity, financially, efficiency, community wise. I just think it's this inefficiency of the budgeting and the other aspects. It was time to revisit this again, and I think this time we clearly got the message that this is what the people want, despite the tax increases for the town people, and of course the village people are going to vote for this because they're 41-cent decrease. But so I won't take up much more of your time, but I'm certainly glad to answer any specific questions you may have. But I think Marty and Justin really hit all the very, very high points.
Great. Well, if you'd all like to stick around as we work through the bill, I'll remind the committee we went through a very detailed walkthrough a few weeks back. That generated a number of questions that led to council and some of our witnesses who've testified this morning. I want to acknowledge Representative Bounty is here from the delegation. I tried to just resolve some of the concerns that we had brought up with legislative council. So my hope is that we can have Tucker take the chair and walk through some of those and see if we can get the bill in a place where we've resolved all of those concerns. I really appreciate the emails back and forth. Mr. Daly, Mr. Smith, former Representative Feltus, and the delegation all worked with legislative council to try to resolve those issues that we had flagged when we did our first detailed walkthrough of the bill as introduced. And now I think Mr. Anderson will come and tell us what we've got. So thank you all so much. I think that just since Tucker's been pulled in a bunch of different directions, we're going to be working off of the as introduced bill, and that he'll be checking off things with us in real time, and then we'll get a draft back. So we'll probably kind of do this sort of drafting in real time, is what Tucker had described it to me when we were gaming things out before we went live this morning. And then I think we'll end up after the floor today, or maybe after we do our S17, if we can get it back that fast, try to move this thing along if we're ready. So let's see how far we can get, and we'll
wild-eyed and ready to go.
be as efficient as we can. I can see
It's almost May. It's almost May.
Yeah.
It's like,
You can do it.
morning.
Legislative Council, we will be working off of the as introduced version. And I have already drafted almost all of the amendment, but there are a few choices that the committee has to make along the way that will change the form. And it should be ready within, let's say, 45 minutes of when you make all the decisions. We can pump this amendment out to the editors and get it back to you. So working off of the as introduced version, from what I understand, the first issue that was going to be addressed was in section 12 of the bill. And if you're working from the as introduced official version, that's going to be on page 4, starting on line 6. And the issue that was flagged actually spills onto page 5 in subsection B. And that is that the initiative ordinances were going to be effective on a shorter timeline than ordinances adopted by the select board, and on a shorter timeline than is prescribed in general law for the effectiveness of ordinances, because there is a petition for reconsideration or rescission that can be filed under general law within 45 days of the enactment of an ordinance, which is why ordinances typically take effect 60 days after their adoption, so that you have that 45-day window to file a petition and give notice to the legislative body that they need to call a special meeting. So in subsection B, the first proposed amendment is to strike the word 30th and replace it with 60th to align this with general law.
All right, can I get a thumbs up on that? It seems great. And my general note, and feel free from the delegation from Linden, anybody raise your hand if you're seeing anything that you disagree with. But I would say generally the amendments that Tucker is talking about, there was a consensus from the folks who are here with us today that there was approval of these from the folks who've been working on the merger locally. But if anybody has any concerns with anything you're hearing, just wave your hand and I'll try to recognize you. Go ahead, Tucker. Thank you.
The next instance of amendment is also on page 5. It was within section 14. And this is one that I haven't added to the draft yet because it merited maybe more discussion, both with the committee and with the representatives from the town. And that is the proposal here to allow a maximum penalty for violation of an ordinance of up to $10,000. And as the committee visited last time, the maximum allowable penalty for violation of any ordinance, civil or criminal, under the general law is $800. From what I understand, there's some context and background here related specifically to damage to town property, such as covered bridges, which happens with some frequency in that area. So I asked the attorneys who work in transportation to give me some feedback on what general law allows. And it is $1,000 or $2,000 as a penalty for damage to a covered bridge. I'm not certain if there's a way for municipalities to get take some sort of civil action through the courts to have the full damage repaid. That, of course, takes some time. So the balance for the committee here is this applies to all ordinances that could be adopted by the town. Maximum penalty of $10,000. Covered bridge penalties under general law are $1,000 or $2,000. They are not assessed per day. It is a $1,000 or $2,000 penalty. The way this is written is it could be up to $10,000 per day of the violation. A balance there for the committee to consider how to address covered bridge damage, and then the broader scope of the $10,000 penalty. And the other piece of this that the committee considered was the determination of the particular fines on a case-by-case basis, which seemed to have, the way it's written, a quasi-judicial role for the select board on it to determine when and how a fine would be assessed. Another item that the committee picked out in this section.
This is just like a fascinatingly like Vermont conversation to have right now. So I guess ultimately like the question is, I'm just trying to understand. So the general law at the 1 to 2,000 is practiced statewide.
For covered bridge
Correct.
damage.
Yes. But that's per offense.
Correct.
Whereas the covered bridge fine at 10,000 here, from what you're saying, could be administered or implemented day over day?
It's really any fine, right?
Any fine, yeah, this is.
Oh, it's general.
This
Okay,
is,
okay,
this
that's
is
why I
not,
asked that piece.
yeah, so,
Okay.
so I just want to bring the
That's what I
committee
asked.
back out. So let me ask you this, Tucker. If I'm understanding this right, the way it's written and the concern that we flagged is this would allow for any violation of an ordinance, the select board to assess up to $10,000 per violation, and it could be per day.
That is correct.
Right. And so I think what we want to do is to say, we're going with $800, the normal max for ordinances. But then, because in general law, in most municipalities, the max that they can assess for an ordinance is $800 for a fine. But then what Tucker's asking us to consider is just for covered bridges, sort of, you know, saying that the town can assess what's in general law, that the state is already fining folks who damage a covered bridge. But the $10,000 came from an existing penalty that's in a town ordinance, I think, if I'm understanding that correctly. That's a big question.
So I got 80% of the way there. I was crossing.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're
No, please, yeah.
Representative Morgan.
Just a quickie, I heard on the radio this morning, they were saying the notch is now back open. They were talking about this and I think those numbers sound the same, 1,000, 2,000 for a second offense, or is it 25%? Are they mirroring that, or is it
I think it's 1,000 and 2,000 under general law for that
kind of
damage.
infraction?
The way that this could be sculpted is, if you want to mirror general law, is to make this section specific to those sorts of traffic offenses. And Lyndon could suggest some language about what they're trying to address. And I could work with the transportation attorney to call out specifically the type of damage they're trying to target with this maximum penalty. And then the town would still be able to use, without any reference to it, the general law maximum penalties of $800 for their other town ordinances. And if there are specific ordinances that allow day-to-day penalties, still apply as well.
And now it's Mr. Bailey's hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, a quick question, Tucker, is, I understand what you're saying about maximum fines. Is there anything that we could add language plus damages occurred? Because part of the reason for the excessive amount on the fines was twofold. One was to be a deterrent, hopefully, because the bridges keep getting hit. And two was to cover our expenses every time the bridge was hit. So that was also part of the reason for that large amount of fine. I don't know if that's possible in any language.
That would absolutely be possible. And then the recommendation that I would give the committee to consider there is, if the ordinance is going to provide for the assessment of a penalty that is the same amount as the damage incurred, that should be specified as a civil penalty, because I'm just thinking that there are dollar amounts where an ordinance violation above a certain criminal fine, if that were to be assessed, would become a felony.
So I'll acknowledge Representative Hooper in just a second, but I just want the committee and everybody involved to understand, if we go down this road, it's very likely that we're talking about this bill taking a stop in judiciary and slowing it down. And given the calendar math, if the priority for the community is to have this murder happen this year, I would highly recommend punting this to a future charter amendment to not hold up the whole bill. So that may be the better part of valor here. Willing to work on it, but I don't know how much we want to get into some of this criminal law piece that isn't in our wheelhouse in the context of trying to get your charter through. So Representative Hooper, and then I'll go across the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Generally speaking, I assume you've had this incident happen before.
Oh, they have.
And I would suspect it's usually a commercial vehicle. Are you not recovering your damages from their insurance provider? Justin? Daniel?
We don't always catch the person, and most of them are hit and runs. I mean, as far as, if there isn't somebody else right there at the scene that has obviously witnessed it, we don't always identify the vehicle. A lot of the box trucks are plain white and nondescript. And we don't catch the license plate on them. So the ones we do, obviously, yeah, we go through their insurance and we get the damages, but, there are a number of cases where we don't. We are very fortunate to have one adjoining property owner that has a security system, and one of the cameras does face out his front yard and down to the bridge. That's how I'm sure a lot of you folks get to see videos on Channel 3 News of trucks going through the I do apologize. I am gonna have to run to another hearing now, so hopefully Dan and Marty will be able to answer your questions moving forward. Thank you.
I agree. Move forward.
Okay, so Representative Chase.
V-Trans, I think this is for you because you were on transportation. V-Trans can recover damages for guardrails or if somebody hits a bigger bridge or something like that, right? Or is it capped at the $1,000 or $2,000 that you referenced?
Yeah, I think what's happening in this particular section here is we've kind of, in the way this was introduced, it's muddied the waters between what's the fine that can be charged as a violation of the ordinance. And then it's trying to get at using the fine to recover damages. And that's a civil penalty that usually would be like a small claims court thing. And so the Agency of Transportation has lawyers that take people to court all the time to recover damage, especially when it's, a commercial incident where there's been some, kind of negligence and it's damaged state property. But that's different than assessing a fine. And so here we have kind of a muddy an attempt to get the damages through the assessment of a fine, which is causing us some consternation, especially given that it's written so broad that it would cover every single ordinance. And I think I would be very hesitant to approve a charter that allowed towns to assess $10,000 fines for public health and safety ordinance violations or things like that.
In Greenville.
Right.
Yeah, you didn't register your dog, that's $8,000. Representative Nugent, okay.
Actually, I think my question is for you, because I'm trying to understand. It sounds like if we let them have the max fine of $800, okay, fine, that's within general law. If they're allowed to assess for damages civilly, that's also okay in the normal course of things. But if they were, it's just we can't venture into the criminal fine territory, and then it would go to judiciary. But it seems like, from what I'm understanding, we could do the other two things.
Yeah, I think if we stay in the realm of sort of where other, what we do in other charters or in referring to general law, where we're not creating a new criminal penalty, especially one that gets into felony territory, that I think we are sort of safely in our wheelhouse. If we if we were inadvertently, to Tucker's caution there, creating a penalty that was so high, it got us into criminal amounts, which this one really would, I think, as written. Then we're talking about sending this judiciary and having a whole novel thing that I don't think was the intention here.
It sounds like just that it might help in the interim rather than have no recourse for the damage, to have at least like a fee and an ability to sue for civil damages in there.
Yeah, I think that's kind of covered under general law, but Tucker, do you want to?
So the general law provisions would allow the municipality to adopt a criminal or civil penalty associated with the town ordinance of up to $800, period. If you wanted to leave room for a higher penalty associated with these sorts of violations, or the possibility that a civil penalty could be applied up to the amount of damage done to the town's infrastructure, you could absolutely put that in here. That would constrain the town so that they're not allowed to adopt a criminal penalty that would be applied to these operators, but would give them the room You could even put in up to $10,000 or whatever the appropriate amount would be as a civil penalty for damages experienced.
So for our Lindenville delegation, does that sound like a plan forward for us to say general law applies to ordinances, except when we're talking about, damage to infrastructure or property or however we want to word it, that has to do, and then a civil penalty could be assessed up to the amount of actual damages.
I would be fine with that, Marty.
Yes, I would agree. That was the consensus of the select board when we talked about it last week.
Okay.
That could be a solution for us.
Committee, how do we feel about we'll take a look at some wordsmithing that I believe Tucker will be able to ably do. Seeing thumbs
Yeah.
up. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
You got it.
There was that second point that Tucker brought up about the kind of fuzzy language that talked about the amount of particular fine to be determined by the select board on a case-by-case basis. That is not something that we intended to be there, or at least not interpreted the way that Tucker said it could be interpreted. And we certainly would not object to that being struck, taken out.
Seeing nodding. Representative Byron, go ahead.
I'm just trying to get an idea of the scope of the problem. How many covered bridges do you have within your municipal boundaries? How frequently are the impacts? And do you have an estimated annual cost to the municipality?
We have two main covered bridges that are still on frequently used, well, where we have 5 or 6 covered bridges, Marty. I'm sorry. Yeah, but we have 2 that are on roads. One, the Linden Center Bridge is the one that gets hit more frequently, and it's hard to give a number, but on average, I would say it gets hit 4 or 5 times a year.
Oh, wow.
And we've worked on a number of ways to try to mitigate that, which we won't go into. The costs vary. Again, like Justin said, it depends on if we can catch the individual, we can fine them and get some money from the fine or charge their insurance companies to repair. But the damage is really, it varies. Sometimes it's simply a matter of just smacking off one board on the top. And sometimes if the truck goes through the bridge, it will cause extensive damage, which the town crew repairs it. So a lot of that is done in kind, but I would say roughly every incident is probably, if my memory serves me right, about $2,000 to $3,000. By the times we do repair for boards and paint and labor and time, that's probably an average, but.
No, and every minute your municipal staff road crew is working on that, that's the minute they're not working on something else. So road time is money. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the bridge is closed. There's that too. Yes.
Exactly. And 3 years ago, I think the bridge had to be closed for an extensive period of time because there was some possible structural damage. So we had to shut the bridge down. We had to get a engineering firm in there. We had to hire a company to come in and do. And that was, I don't even remember what the cost was there, but it was in the $40,000 or $50,000 range. But that's kind of rare. Most of the incidences are small and close the bridge for an hour or two, and the town crew comes in and replaces some boards. But potential is there to do some significant damage.
Thank you.
Sounds like it might be worthwhile investing in your own camera system.
Well, we're working on that. We're also in the process right now of doing 2 big metal frames on each side, the north and south side of the bridge, that will greet any truck. We call it affectionately the can openers. That will affectionately, greet any trucks that are above the height. And so those are being fabricated right now, and hopefully we'll be in by midsummer.
All right, let's I think we've got our homework here for you, Tucker. So let's keep moving.
The third issue that is up for amendment is in section 27, which is on page 9. Excuse me. Specifically in subdivision C3, governing the appraisers, and that's on page 10, on line 10. And the issue that was flagged by the committee here is that the appraiser would be appointed by the Board of Listers rather than the Select Board. And the proposal is to strike the opening to that subdivision and just have it state that the Select Board would appoint the appraiser.
Tucker, did you skip over section 25 and 26? That was another section that was flagged that we addressed. About the
Go back through the
term of appointments.
We did. All right.
This had to do with just making sure that we weren't creating a situation where there was a conflict between the person was appointed to fill a vacancy and then the newly elected person in terms of when the terms ended. We just wanted to make sure, and I think it was a little unclear in the reading, but then as we dug into it, it turned out to be okay. But Tucker, if you have any other opinion than that.
The only notes that I had in this section was whether a transitional provision was necessary, but based on the notes that I have, the answer was no.
Yeah, I think we were concerned that maybe we were creating a situation where you could have two sort of competing people, but it sounds like it is clear enough that there wouldn't be a conflict in the terms. So I don't think there's anything for us to do there, but if anybody wants to reread it and think through all the calendar math and the dates of the elections and the 90-day period, there seems to not be an incident where you would have the appointed person and the elected person have a conflict in their terms. It seems like it's okay.
Well, if you remember the first day of the session with the fiscal year versus real year fiasco in Act number 1, calendar math is not one of my skills.
I think we're okay here, but if anybody wants us to take a look at this language further, I definitely not time for that, but I think we can move on from this one.
Okay.
So you had brought up, Tucker, the appointment, and I think that for an appointment by the Board of Listers is weird. I think the appraiser should be done by the Select Board unless anybody has any problem with that.
Makes sense.
Make that change.
Section 28. This was flagged for policy discussion. This is the recall provision. And that's on page 11. I think this was flagged for general discussion for the committee. I don't have anything in the amendment yet. There are other municipalities that have recall provisions. The standards for minimum percentage of voters that need to petition is similar to other municipalities. I flagged last time Underhill. Since then, Middlebury has also been used as an example of a municipality with recall provisions that are substantially similar to this. So it's an issue for the committee to discuss as a policy issue, not necessarily a legal issue.
I think at the time we were going through this, voiced my general discomfort with recall petitions. They can oftentimes kind of create shenanigans, as we've seen in other states. But if the community feels like it's important to have this and approved it as part of the charter, I don't want to I'll defer to the community since it's got a similar construction to other folks, but was there I might ask Representative Bounty and former Representative Feltus, was there a pretty robust discussion in the community about recall provisions, or is this more of the charter committee having wanting to have this power?
It was more the charter committee, simply because we knew that there was not that availability in regular state law. We knew that other communities had it. There hasn't been a concern in our community, but we just thought it would be prudent to put that clause in there in case the question ever did come up. And we set it with the threshold of petitioners and the threshold of voters, what we thought was high enough to discourage any just frivolous attempts at changing things. So we just thought it was a prudent thing to have in the charter in case it was needed, but at a higher enough threshold that it would protect the community as well.
And this is a 15% of the registered voters. So
To initiate the recall process.
I'm okay with leaving this in unless anybody on the committee.
I appreciate the fact that it was elevated to 15%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I think, to your point, Tucker, that's like what Middlebury has, is very similar to
Very
that.
similar. Underhill, I believe, is also 15%. There are some charter recall provisions that go as high as 25%, but in general, they fall between 10 to 15% per petition.
Great. All right, let's keep rolling.
All right, moving along to section 33, this is the select board meetings, procedural pieces of the charter. And there were a few issues that the committee flagged in here. The first was that there's a general prohibition on any matter being voted on in executive session by the select board. And what I flagged there is that generally aligns with the open meeting law, except that real estate transactions can be voted on in executive session. The reason being that advanced disclosure of a decision to purchase real property or buildings or infrastructure could disadvantage the municipality if that were known to the public prematurely. Of course, that information does become public when the transaction is made. And the suggestion is to remove that reference so that the town would operate under the open meeting law.
And the town agrees.
Yeah, so let's just make sure that provision around real estate, I know being in Albans and we've been very active in the real estate space, it's important if a town, I think the motions in general law that you have to make, Tucker probably knows this better than I do, there has to be a finding of the legislative body that the town will be disadvantaged.
The premature disclosure of the information would disadvantage the town.
I'm not usually the one who has to make that motion. It's typically the chair of the city, the president of the city council who would make that motion. So he got used to doing it in the several real estate transactions that we had.
And that covers everything from initial investigation through potentially the decision to actually go forward with purchasing and starting the process. And that scope is there for things like, we would like to build a municipal swimming pool, so we're going to look for property that could fit the pool and it would be appropriately zoned. Well, if that was a decision made in an open meeting, then potentially, the gold mining members of the public could go out and scoop up all the available property and raise the price and disadvantage the town.
Yeah, so this is right at the top of page 16. I hear a little bit of committee members looking around for this exact language.
And I'm sorry that I actually skipped maybe something that came up before then. There was a reference in subsection C on page 15 that was written with the intent of having an exception that set aside the Board of Civil Authority specific provisions in Title 17. But the way that charters are interpreted as a form of special law could cause a lot of interpretational issues where this would be potentially seen as an exception to the Title 17 provisions instead of as an exception to what is provided in subsection C. The suggestion was to strike that clause so that Title 17 could stand on its own. The BCA provisions would stand on their own and the town would be governed by general law, which the committee discussed as perhaps the intent of the town was to just follow general law.
I think we should go with the general law here, this, and avoid the confusion. So we'll strike that reference.
All right, still in section 33, the last piece here was in subsection F, is on page 16, which would allow any member of the select board to add items to the agenda upon the commencement of the meeting, provided that the select board votes, a majority of the select board votes to approve the addition of the agenda item. Typically, under the open meeting law, you have requirements for when an agenda item is added, falling for regular meetings, special meetings, or emergency meetings of a body. Emergency items may be added, but that agenda has to be warned separately from whatever the previously warned meeting was. The same for special meetings. So this is, again, a policy decision. Linden could operate under its own procedures for adding items to an agenda for a meeting, or if this was to be removed, they would abide by the open meeting law, which requires, 48 hours posting of agendas for regular meetings, 24 hours for special meetings, and emergency meetings can be warned with less than 24 hours notice, but the scope of the meeting has to only be that emergency issue.
That's the way we follow now, or we have followed. We only vote or discuss warned items. And same thing, if there's an emergency meeting, we have a 24-hour. So I don't see any problem with that language being omitted if that's what the open meeting law says.
Yeah, I think we can just omit that and fall back on general law there. I just want to make sure we're not saying to a town, you can go ahead and add unwarranted votes to your agenda that way.
Hold the entire F out.
Yeah. Unless anybody on the committee has any.
I totally agree.
Protects the town too, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
Why we do these charter reviews?
Thank you.
Why we're here. The committee also flagged section 34 as potentially needing to conform with the open meeting law. And I think the reason the committee flagged this was in subsection B relating to approval of the minutes by the select board and where the minutes would be filed. And the only piece that was missing here from what's already governed by the open meeting law is the posting of the minutes to the public agencies public bodies website. And re-reviewing this language, it would be harmonized with the open meeting law, whether this is amended or not.
so
You can amend subsection B to just state that minutes shall be kept in accordance with the open meeting law and filed in the town clerk's office in the Cobley Library to belt and suspender it. But even if you didn't do that, the requirement would still be that the open meeting law requirements, because they are more specific in this instance, would be harmonized with this charter provision.
So we don't really need to do anything here to, let's not create the need for an edit that doesn't have any policy significance unless anybody really wants to.
No,
Okay.
just to specify, so always assume the open meeting law, and then this is just in addition.
Yeah, so if it's more specific, so for instance, open meeting law wouldn't require them to have it at the Cobley Library. This is more specific. So therefore they have to do everything that open meeting law requires and have this filing at the Cobley Library.
And the town clerk's office.
And the town clerk's.
Okay, thank you.
So it's like a minimum standard and then they can go
Yeah.
above and beyond.
Sure.
think we got into this discussion a little bit when we were talking about which codes of ethics apply and
Yeah.
look at that.
The addition of one word would have completely changed this if they had said shall only be filed.
Okay.
Good thing they didn't.
Where the words on page matter very much. Thanks, Tucker.
We're rounding the corner. Section 42, this was the requirement that the ballot boxes be open for 9 hours for any election. And the suggestion here, I believe this was worked out with the town, was to get rid of the word any and specify that the 9-hour opening time shall be for town elections, so that it doesn't impact the general election requirements for when the booths are open.
Everybody okay with that? Yeah.
Okay, section 61. This is the fiscal year provision. I flagged this just as an issue for drafting standards, which is that if you say when a fiscal year or whatever the specific municipal calendar year start date is, that also functions as the end date. And if you call out end dates and times, you inadvertently eliminate one day out of the legal year. So the proposed technical correction or cleanup here would be to strike the last part of that says and end at 12 midnight on the last day of the following December. Then you have a fiscal year that starts on the first day of January, period. And that's when the fiscal year starts. And the legal assumption is that the previous fiscal year ends one infinitesimal millisecond before the new one begins.
Just as a standard.
Yes.
So that second half of the sentence is pretty much superfluous.
Nothing that the legislature in law is superfluous, according to the Supreme Court of Vermont, which is why if that clause stayed in there, the legal interpretation would be that there is missing time.
Well,
Time elastic.
yeah, so let's not get too far down that hole. So I believe the simple remedy to this was to remove the time.
Yes, the time and the last day of December.
That's a suggestion, let's do that.
So then just a period after January then?
Yes, that does it. That gets them exactly what they
Scratch the
want
rest.
without any potential legal issues around when their fiscal year ends and the new one begins. And there's a one day a year where the select board can do whatever they want and it doesn't, it isn't accountable.
The reporter does say Tucker is
The power that we have in here is really something. We're controlling time now.
Yeah, elasticity.
I love it. Great, it sounds like we have a simple solution there.
So that's how it gets reported. It's one infinitesimal second before midnight.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
That was some classic Tucker Anderson right there. I just want to say on that infinitesimal, that's.
I couldn't remember what is shorter than a nanosecond. Gigasecond. The section 63, we're on page 22. This was flagged potentially because the budget proposal timelines may not line up with general law. And if the town just wanted to rely on general law instead of having more specific charter language related to when meetings for the budget have to be held, that this could be eliminated and the town would just follow Title 17 provisions, which from what I understand, is likely what the town is just doing now. Business as usual. Okay.
Seeing thumbs up, seeing nods, okay.
Section 69, which is on page 25. The issue that was flagged in this section is that, and policy decision for the town, the members of this committee, is that it steals a little bit of flexibility from the town, actually. It requires that interest and penalties on unpaid taxes shall be levied at the maximum allowable amount, which is 8% under general law. And that removes the authority that exists for every municipality to actually choose what the interest and penalties will be. So if the town does want to be locked into whatever the maximum amount is under general law, can absolutely leave the shall in there. If it's more in their interest to be allowed to use their general law authority to choose from 0% up to 8%, this could be changed to a may.
I believe that May was acceptable and actually the preference of folks that this was an inadvertent locking into the maximum, but I can't.
Well,
speak for
no,
the-
I looked at all of the last 15 years of our town warnings, and they always say the maximum amount. When it's voted on at town meeting, interest shall be whatever, and it has always said, the last 15 years, it has said the maximum amount. So I believe that's what the town has wanted to do, and that's what the village has done in their warnings as well.
Right, and that eliminates when you go to a tax appeal, that we hear occasionally, that it's eliminates the inconsistency that could happen. It makes it very challenging for some people to come and for us to say, well, this person should only get 2%, but this person should get 3%. So the language clearly says that there's one standard for all.
So it sounds like this was thought through more than I would have thought, and that there's a desire to be able to say, nope, that's what it says in the charter. How does the committee feel about leaving this as is, given that testimony?
I say leave it as is.
Okay. Yeah. That's fine with me. Just wanted to make sure that we were checking and taking away the permissive authority that a town has under general law. That's not usually what we do, but I can understand given that history, that makes a lot of sense. All right, we'll leave that as introduced in that section.
So those were all of the specific amendments that the committee considered. You had also asked me to work with the attorneys who cover utilities, and specifically municipal utilities, and get back to you about what are the differences between what is proposed in this charter and what is available to municipal electric utilities under general law. And after lengthy discussions with Maria Royal, who's the attorney who works in the subject area, and a thorough review of these sections, the response was that generally these provisions track with general law, that the wording is a little outdated and a little more confusing than general law, that it may potentially, and I'm buttressing this a lot, may potentially somehow be interpreted to be more specific and controlling than what is allowed under general law. And that there are really two issues to flag for all of you. The first is that the language, the way it's constructed in one of the subsections, could be interpreted to allow this utility to exercise eminent domain outside of the municipal boundaries. So it could be interpreted to allow the Linden Electric Department to exercise eminent domain authority outside of the town of Linden. And if that is not the intent, then perhaps the structure of those subdivisions should be changed so that the eminent domain subsection is separate from some of the other abilities, such as acquiring property outside of the municipal bounds, which is why it could be interpreted that way. The second thing to flag, and this is potentially the more dynamic issue that's more straightforward of a deviation from the general law, is the ability in subsection B of section 84, page 31, section 84, page 31, subsection B, which allows the Board of Electric Commissioners to issue revenue-backed bonds, that's general law, or general obligation bonds. The difference between these two types of bonds that might be issued, of course, is that revenue-backed bonds are backed by the revenue received by the municipal enterprise. So that would be revenue received from the ratepayers in each of the service territory towns served by Linden Electric Department. The general obligation bonds are bonds that are issued as general obligations that are backed by the residents, voters, and taxpayers of the municipality, which in this case would be the town of Linden. So, policy decision for those general obligation bonds, because those are typically not exercised and not available to municipal utilities, is should the Linden Electric Department be able to issue bonds that are backed solely by the residents of the town of Linden, instead of being restricted to the revenue-backed bonds that are dispersed amongst the ratepayers in all of the service territory municipalities. The general obligation bond issue really is only going to have an impact on the town, because the town taxpayers are the ones who might be on the hook for paying back those general obligation bonds for their municipal utility.
Representative Higley.
Any idea whether there's any other municipal water and light departments that do this?
It was my impression, discussing this with the other attorney, that this would be unique, that there are not other municipal utilities that have this authority. However, there is an expert who deals with this that we can have provide information to the committee about what the impact of this particular decision would be. And again,
The next question is just asking the town whether that was their actual consideration, that they were looking for the possibility of financing some that would, all general taxpayers would have to kick back.
Yes, this particular section was, the history is that this whole section about Lindenville Electric was patterned after the town of Stowe, and Stowe also merged their town and village electric utility. So most of our language comes from that, maybe a little outdated, but it comes from that. This particular section, our utility attorney asked to have some changes to it. And what is here is what he specifically requested based upon, yes, the acknowledgement we could have general obligation bonds that, yes, the owners of the electric department would be responsible for, as well as revenue bonds that the users would be responsible for. And we understood that distinction, that could be a possibility. And that if the general obligation bonds were ever issued, they would have to be applied, they would obviously have to be approved by the select board and also the voters of the town in order to have the general obligation bonds.
Yeah, if Tucker can confirm that, I mean, I don't have a lot of heartburn about this provision as long as we're not exempting that issuance of a general obligation bond from the vote, approval by the voters. And it sounds like, according to law, the end of that paragraph.
That was the exact phrase that our utility attorney said to me that made me feel comfortable that yes, the voters are still going to have to approve this general obligation bond.
and that would be consistent with general law in Title 24, Chapter 53 about voting on general obligation bonds within a municipality. That was when I ineloquently said that this would only impact the voters and residents of the town.
And again, Tucker, if you can, the specifics of that in regards to, it would have to be a vote both by the select board and the residents?
Well, let's go back to the charter language. The language in subsection B is permissive for the Board of Electric Commissioners to issue those bonds. So the proposal likely is first going to come from the Board of Electric Commissioners and then would be put to a vote, must be put to a vote in order to be approved. And the reason, of course, is that because the obligation bond is going to be backed by the municipality's taxing authority, the voters are required to consent through vote to the issuance of a bond tied to municipal revenue through taxation.
Okay, thanks.
And I can find an attorney that's more eloquent with bonding. So that would also be.
I think there are a couple of us who are pretty familiar with that area. I guess I would ask the committee, this is a little bit of a deviation from what I think some of our other municipal utilities have, but given that there's such a relationship between the municipality, especially this merged municipality, and the utility itself, I think that given that it's, you know, the voters of the town have to approve the issuance of a general obligation bond, it's not a wild deviation, and I wouldn't want us to have to go too far down that rabbit hole unless anybody feels uncomfortable with this section. Say Representative Higley and I probably represent the people who most want to protect the ability for the voters to approve those bonds. And we're, you know, looking at this language, but seem to be convincing ourselves that it's okay.
Well, again, I'm concerned that it came from the attorney, which is fine, but did the charter, you know, the citizens who approved the charter actually understand that as well? I guess I feel comfortable with the way Tucker has explained it, that there's going to be an actual vote, so they will have the opportunity to say whether or not they want to kick into improvements to the utility.
Just as a side note for you, Lindenville Electric is not just Linden. It covers 11 towns. There are 5,700 customers around the 11 surrounding towns. So it's more than started out as just the village, and of course it's the largest municipal utility in the state, space-wise, geographic-wise.
Any other policy questions for us to consider here to inform the updated draft? Right. So I think, committee, that what I'd like to do, since we've given Tucker a bunch of homework, is for us to come back to this just before lunch. So we're slated to take a little bit more testimony on S17. We will do that after a short break, and then do you think if we come back to this at 11:40, we could look at an updated draft?
Yes.
Great. So Tucker, I will send you on your way. We will end our work on this. Committee, we're scheduled to be back on S17 and to hear from the network on the RFA standby service section. Why don't we take a break until 10 of, so that'll give us 12 minutes here to do a bio break, and then we'll get back to that. And then I'm going to push our walkthrough of S9 off to tomorrow or Friday so that the decks are clear after floor today to really work on our updated draft of S17, which I think Tim is working on now. The issue that had come up yesterday that I believe we can get resolved based on Annie Noonan's testimony around the open position. Tim is working with JFO on just figuring out with the Department of Human Resources retitling how we sort of work that into our bill versus the budget. So there's an open question there he's trying to resolve in the background. But there you are, Tim. Yeah, so we'll hear more about that. But for now, we'll go